On June 4th, 1944, just 2 days before the world turned toward D-Day and Normandy, a hunter-killer group built around the escort carrier, the USS Guadalcanal, was stalking German U-boats in the Atlantic. With the carrier were 5 destroyer escorts: the USS Pillsbury, the USS Pope, the USS Flattery, the USS Chatelaine, USS Jenks. They formed Task Group 22.3, and they were built to find and destroy submarines. Late that morning, Chatelaine made a sonar contact and began a series of hedgehog and depth charge attacks. The pressure forced U-505 to surface. A small boarding party in a motor whaleboat launched from a destroyer escort raced toward the damaged and slowly sinking U-boat. There was the added threat of enemy gunfire, of scuttling charges, and booby traps. This was the first successful boarding and capture of an enemy man-of-war on the high seas by the United States Navy since 1815. Today, 82 years later, the USS Slater's own wooden motor whaleboat still carries that legacy. The Slater's boat is a 26-foot motor whaleboat Mark II, the last major wooden motor whaleboat designed before the Navy transitioned to fiberglass. It closely mirrors the whaleboat used by the USS Pillsbury during the capture of U-505. Old wooden motor whaleboats require special care. Over the years, it has been painstakingly restored, caulked, sanded, repainted, re-rigged, re-engined, and kept seaworthy through decades of volunteer craftsmanship. With the whaleboat back in the water, the crew turned their attention to restoration projects. A priority, the whaleboat davits. If the Slater can get these operational again and train a crew to safely raise and lower a motor whaleboat, the ship can avoid winter storage fees and keep the boat aboard where it belongs. Relearning a routine process perfected by destroyer escort sailors during World War II is another part of the legacy that helps us tell the destroyer escort story of sailors in small boats with big missions. Another major restoration project is the Flying Bridge. Destroyer escorts use an open bridge design borrowed from the Royal Navy. It gave officers exceptional situational awareness during convoy escort and anti-submarine operations. But it exposed crews to sun, wind, rain, snow, and freezing spray. When the Slater served in the Greek Navy, an enclosure was added. It was removed before the Slater arrived in Albany in 1997, and the restoration to the continued wartime configuration continues today. Below decks, work continues on the compressed air system, the air flasks, valves, and piping that supply high-pressure air needed to crank the ship's 8-cylinder and 16-cylinder diesel engines. This matters. The Slater still uses her 8-cylinder diesel engines to provide electric power. That's going to be essential when the ship eventually travels to the shipyard for hull maintenance. Even small jobs matter. Several faucets in the heads are being replaced because of minor leaks. These authentic World War II artifacts controlled freshwater use. Destroyer escorts relied on evaporators to convert seawater to fresh. This required fuel consumption, and freshwater waste impacted combat efficiency. These projects keep the Slater afloat and authentic, but they also support the larger story we're telling. A museum ship, like the Slater, is a stage where the narrative brings the history to life. This month, the museum introduced D.E. Docent Cards. These business card-sized handout includes a QR code that links to additional information about destroyer escorts, perfect for answering probing questions without delaying a tour. On their first day of use, they proved their value. A visitor asked, quote, "What kind of ships were in the typical convoy?" That inspired a special feature that will release in July, a deep dive into the merchant ships that destroyer escorts protected. This will include Liberty ships, Victory ships, and T2 tankers. Then came a second follow-up question. Were there concrete ships in convoys? The short answer is yes. Not only the concrete ships exist, but we've identified a destroyer escort that escorted one. That feature story is now in development as well. I found that the cards aren't just useful aboard the Slater. Someone noticed my Slater cap, and conversations naturally turned to interest in the Slater, and the cards helped facilitate a future visit. The Destroyer Escort Historical Museum is part of a wider community preserving historic destroyers, destroyer escorts, and frigates, ships collectively known as tin cans. This month, the Slater received a grant from Tin Can Sailors, the National Association of Destroyer Veterans. On June 20th, the USS Slater held its annual Destroyer Escort Day commemoration. Since 1991, DE sailors had marked the third Saturday in June as a day to remember the 15 destroyer escorts lost in World War II. Once observed by the DE Sailors Association chapters across America, the Slater is now the last place where this date is formally commemorated. The ceremony included a color guard, musical tributes, and carnations committed into the Hudson River, one for each ship lost.